There is a particular kind of evil that does not announce itself. It does not kick down doors. It does not wear a snarl. It does not carry darkness on its face like a warning. No. The most terrifying kind of evil in this world wears a quiet smile. It knows your name. It crouches to your eye level. It speaks gently, the way a patient adult speaks to a frightened child, and it offers something small, something achingly ordinary, like a few coins or a promise of lunch, or simply the warmth of being noticed in a city that has spent years pretending you do not exist. That is the evil that lived inside Marcelo Costa de Andrade. And what makes his story so utterly, stomach-hollowingly unbearable is not just what he did. Though what he did was among the most savage acts ever committed on Brazilian soil, it is the reason he gave for doing it. He was not consumed by rage. He was not chasing power. He was not driven by hatred toward his victims. Marcelo Costa de Andrade looked police officers in the eye, after confessing to the rape and murder of 14 young boys, and told them with complete, undisturbed calm that he had done those children a favor. That he had loved them in his way. That by strangling the life from their small bodies, by violating them in death and drinking their blood in the dark, he had rescued them, plucked them from the misery of the favela and delivered them, pure and untouched, directly into the arms of God. He believed this, every syllable. And that belief, that quiet, monstrous, unshakable conviction, is what separates Marcelo from the monsters we think we understand. Because you can reason with cruelty. You can trace the logic of greed, of revenge, of madness that rages. But how do you argue with salvation? How do you explain to a man who killed 14 children that he was wrong, when he is already certain, in the deepest marrow of his bones, that every single one of those boys is in paradise right now, thanking him? You cannot. And that is the most frightening sentence in this entire story. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. Tonight, we explore 3 unsettling cases where the truth hid beneath what first appeared completely harmless. This story came together through many hours of careful research and thoughtful work. Every detail was included with purpose, to create an immersive experience while treating these real events with the respect they deserve. This channel exists to keep these stories alive and make sure they are never forgotten. Now, please take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the story of the vampire of Niterói, the case of Marcelo Costa de Andrade, aka the Angel Butcher of the favela. Now let's begin. Welcome back. Or perhaps, welcome for the first time, to a case that will not leave you quietly. A case that crawled out of the slums of Rio de Janeiro in 1991 and burned itself so deeply into Brazilian criminal history that forensic psychiatrists still travel across the world to sit across from this man, decades later, hoping to find some thread of logic they can pull, some explanation that makes the shape of him comprehensible. They never quite find it. He sits there, cooperative, pleasant, soft-voiced, and he tells them, with the patience of a man who has explained something obvious many times before, that the children were suffering, that he helped them, that heaven is real, and that he knows that those boys are there. 14 boys, ages 5 to 13, murdered across a 9-month spree in the vicinity of Itaboraí and Niterói, roughly 30 kilometers outside Rio de Janeiro. A stretch of urban poverty where bodies could disappear for weeks before anyone came looking, because in 1991, children in Brazil's favelas were already dying at a rate that numbed the authorities into near paralysis. At least 4 children were being executed every day on Rio's streets. Not by serial killers, but by organized extermination squads made up of off-duty police officers and security guards, hired by ordinary citizens who had decided the most efficient solution to poverty was simply to eliminate the poor. In that climate of casual, systemic child murder, one quiet man was moving through the noise and taking boys who were already invisible, children so forgotten by the system that their disappearances barely registered as ripples. Marcelo Costa de Andrade strangled them. He beat some of them. He sexually violated their bodies before death and after it. He drank the blood of at least one victim, collected carefully in a bowl, because he believed it would transfer the boy's beauty into himself. He returned to burial sites with machetes. He tucked one victim's hands carefully into the child's own shorts so the rats would not chew the fingers. He confessed to all of it, every detail, without flinching, without remorse, with the tone of a man recounting an ordinary week. Brazil has had killers. Brazil has had massacres. But Brazil has never, before or since, produced anything quite like this. Sit down. Settle in. Because what you are about to hear is not a story about a monster wearing a monster's face. It is a story about something far worse. A monster who genuinely, sincerely, completely believed he was an angel. This is the true crime case of Marcelo Costa de Andrade, the vampire of Niterói, the angel butcher of the favela. And it begins, as so many of the darkest stories do, with a childhood that never had a chance. Please, if you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. Rio de Janeiro, 1967. A city of extraordinary beauty and grotesque contradiction, where breathtaking beaches sat within eyesight of hillside slums packed so densely with human desperation that the walls themselves seemed to sweat. Into this world, on January 2nd of that year, Marcelo Costa de Andrade was born, the son of poor migrants who had drifted to Rio from Brazil's impoverished northeast, chasing the same exhausted dream that millions before them had chased and found waiting with empty hands. His earliest years were spent in Rocinha, a name that means little farm in Portuguese, a cruel joke of a name for what was in reality one of the largest and most violent favelas in all of South America. Perched on a hillside overlooking the gleaming luxury of São Conrado, Rocinha was home to approximately 200,000 people crammed into a labyrinth of crumbling brick corridors, open sewers, and alleyways so narrow that two adults could barely pass each other without touching. Criminal factions ruled the neighborhood with the casual authority of local government. Children roamed the passages from the time they could walk, because there was nowhere else to go and no one particularly watching. The contrast between what Rocinha's residents could see, the glittering beaches, the beautiful apartments, the world of abundance just down the hill, and what they actually possessed was not lost on anyone. It lived in the community like a slow infection. Marcelo's mother was a maid, one of the invisible workforce of women who cleaned the homes of Rio's wealthy and returned each evening to conditions that were barely habitable. She was regularly abused by her husband, and the violence of that household settled into the walls of Marcelo's earliest memories like damp. When his parents eventually separated, a decision was made that would, in theory, protect the young Marcelo from the chaos of the Rio household. He was sent, at the age of 5, to live with his grandparents in Serra, a northeastern state of bleach-dry heat and deeply conservative traditions, far from the noise of the favela. It was not protection. The beatings came differently there, administered with belts and other objects by his grandparents, methodical rather than explosive, but no less damaging for their regularity. The message to the boy was consistent regardless of geography. His body was not his own, his comfort was not a priority, and pain was simply the texture of being alive. Eventually Marcelo was returned to Rio de Janeiro, back to his mother, who had by now taken a new partner. This man also beat him, and then, from the age of 10, something else began. Something worse than the beatings. Other relatives, beyond the household, sexually abused Marcelo during this period. The abuse was not a single event. It was repeated. It was normalized. And it carved channels into the boy's developing mind that would never fully close. He attended a boys' school for a period, but his academic performance was poor and his classmates were merciless, taunting him, calling him retarded, compounding the isolation he already carried like a second skin. At 14, the school expelled him, as its enrollment was limited to boys between 6 and 14 years of age. With no education, no prospects, and a home environment that offered no cushion, Marcelo made the decision that many boys in his position made. He began selling his body. At 14 years old, Marcelo Costa de Andrade entered into prostitution, exchanging sex for money on the streets of Rio de Janeiro, a city where no one looked too hard at the transactions happening on its sidewalks. It was during this period that Marcelo encountered a man named Antonio Batista Freire. Antonio was older, and the relationship that developed between them became the longest and most significant of Marcelo's young life. Antonio became, in a complex and troubling way, a source of stability, taking Marcelo in, providing some semblance of domestic structure, and introducing him to something that would ultimately prove far more consequential than anyone could have predicted: the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God. The Universal Church, founded in Rio de Janeiro in 1977 by Bishop Edir Macedo, was a Pentecostal denomination that had spread rapidly through Brazil's poor communities, offering a form of faith that was theatrical, immediate, and intensely focused on supernatural intervention. Exorcisms were practiced openly. Evil spirits were cast out in live ceremonies. The church taught that homosexuality was a demonic possession to be expelled, that voodoo and spiritual forces were real and present dangers, and, critically, devastatingly, that children who died before a certain age of moral corruption were guaranteed passage directly into heaven. Marcelo attended services and watched the church's television broadcasts with an absorption that went far beyond casual faith. He internalized its teachings completely. He built an entire internal architecture of belief around what he heard in those pews and on that screen, a theology that was, for him, not metaphor but literal operational truth. At 17, while still in the relationship with Antonio, Marcelo attempted to rape his own 10-year-old brother. He had kept tape recordings of the boy crying, sounds that, he would later reveal, aroused him. The attempt was a clear and chilling signal of what was fermenting beneath the surface, but it was not reported in any way that led to intervention. It was absorbed into the family's silence, the way so many unspeakable things were absorbed into the silence of communities where survival consumed too much energy for confrontation. When Antonio eventually ended the relationship, after several years, for reasons Marcelo never fully elaborated upon, the last stabilizing force in Marcelo's life was removed. He moved back to his mother and brothers in Itaboraí, a working-class neighborhood across the polluted waters of Guanabara Bay from central Rio. Grimmer, quieter, more forgotten than even Rocinha, he left prostitution behind. He secured a legitimate job at a shop in the Copacabana district, distributing flyers for the business, earning a modest but real wage. He attended church. He helped support his family financially. He watched the Universal Church broadcasts every day, and quietly, in the part of himself that no one was watching, something was assembling itself. Some terrible conclusion drawn from a lifetime of abuse and isolation and a religion that had told him over and over that children were the purest creatures on earth and that death, for the innocent, was not an ending but a beginning. The first murder happened in April of 1991. It was not explosive or chaotic. It was deliberate and methodical in the way only a man who has been building toward something can be deliberate. Marcelo spotted a young boy selling sweets on the street, the kind of child that Itaboraí was full of, children working before they were old enough to understand what work meant, children who could be made to listen by the simple act of offering them money they desperately needed. Marcelo offered a small sum. He constructed a story, a Catholic ritual, a distant aunt, a promise of something just over there, just a little way away from the crowd. And the boy went with him. What happened in that remote location was the template for everything that would follow over the next 8 months. Marcelo sexually abused the boy, then strangled him. He told himself, and would later tell police, that what he felt in the aftermath was not guilt. What he felt was certainty. The boy was in heaven now, safe, free from the grinding destitution of street life, from the threat of the extermination squads, from the ordinary violence of a city that had long since decided children like him were expendable. Marcelo had not taken a life. He had delivered one. He went home. He ate lunch. He went back to work. And he began thinking about the next boy. The machinery of his logic was now fully engaged, and machinery, once set in motion, does not simply idle. The urgency grew between killings. Not a dramatic, uncontrollable frenzy, but a quiet, accumulating pressure, like water building behind a dam. He functioned. He smiled. He distributed his flyers on Copacabana Beach, exchanged pleasantries with his colleagues, sat in the pews of his church and sang with what appeared to be genuine devotion. And when the pressure reached its threshold, he went looking. He was extraordinarily good at finding them, because he had once been one of them. He knew exactly what a hungry child looked like, what a lonely child sounded like, what words made a desperate child's eyes light up with the specific hopefulness of someone who has received very little kindness and therefore recognizes every small version of it immediately. He was patient. He was warm. He never rushed. He spoke the language of the favela perfectly, because it was his native tongue. And one by one, through the spring and summer and autumn of 1991, the boys of Itaboraí and the surrounding areas began to disappear. Their families went to the police. Some of them, the ones who had the faith that such an institution would respond to them, which, in a Brazil where 4 favela children were being officially executed per day, was not a guarantee. Reports were filed. Some were investigated briefly. But the sheer volume of child death in Rio de Janeiro during that period created a kind of statistical fog through which a single methodical killer could move with almost complete invisibility. The authorities were not, in 1991, looking for a serial killer working the favelas of Niterói's outskirts. They were trying to hold together a city that was hemorrhaging. Marcelo moved through that fog, unhurried, undetected, and the number climbed. By the time the summer of 1991 reached its peak, Marcelo Costa de Andrade had developed what could only be described as a ritual, not in the dramatic cinematic sense that the word often evokes, but in the precise, habitual sense of a man who has performed the same sequence of actions enough times that they have become automatic. He knew which streets produced the most unattended children. He knew which hours were best. Not too early, when families might still be watchful, not too late, when the boys he targeted had retreated to wherever it was they slept. Mid-morning or early afternoon, when the neighborhoods were active but not supervised. When children moved in those loose, unsupervised orbits that poverty produces, not neglect exactly, but the natural consequence of parents who worked unreachable hours and left their children to the governance of the street. He never appeared threatening. This cannot be emphasized enough because it dismantles something that the true crime genre often takes for granted, the idea that danger announces itself. Marcelo was slight, soft-featured, mild in manner and voice. He did not tower. He did not leer. He was the kind of man you would trust with directions, the kind of man who, if he stopped your child on the street to speak to them, would not set off the alarm in your chest. He looked like someone's harmless uncle. He looked like a church volunteer, which, in a sense, he was. His second confirmed murder brought an element that would define his case in the public imagination forever. The victim was 11-year-old Anderson Gomez Goulart, and what Marcelo did after killing him crossed a line that most crimes, no matter how terrible, do not cross. After strangling the boy, Marcelo collected his blood, deliberately, carefully, in a container, and he drank it. He told investigators, without the slightest apparent self-consciousness, that he had done so because Anderson was beautiful, and Marcelo believed that drinking the boy's blood would transfer that beauty into himself. This was not a psychotic break in the traditional sense. It was a belief, distorted, monstrous, but internally coherent within the framework of magical thinking that had been building in Marcelo's mind for years, fed by a childhood of powerlessness, a theology of supernatural forces, and a consuming preoccupation with youth and beauty that he himself had never possessed. The nickname, the Vampire of Niterói, would come later, when the press finally got hold of what Marcelo had confessed to. But in the summer of 1991, no one was calling him anything. No one even knew he existed. In June of 1991, Marcelo encountered 11-year-old Oder José Muniz dos Santos near a football pitch, one of those threadbare, improvised playing fields that appear in Brazil's poor neighborhoods like small declarations of joy in the middle of deprivation. Oder was the kind of child you would notice. Energetic, present, the kind of boy who inhabited his own existence with a fullness that poorer childhoods sometimes produce, as if aware, at some cellular level, that the present moment is the only reliable one. Marcelo approached him with the familiar script. Money, he said. A ritual. An aunt who needed their help nearby. The promise of something small but tangible in exchange for a short walk. Oder went. They reached a location away from the crowd, and Marcelo attempted to sexually abuse him. Oder resisted, fought back with the desperate energy of a child who understood, in his body if not yet in his mind, that something was terribly wrong. Marcelo strangled him. But even then, Marcelo was not satisfied that the act was complete, that the soul had fully departed and reached its destination. He strangled the boy a second time, pressing down until there was no question, ensuring in his mind that the passage to heaven was secured. He went home for lunch. He ate, he rested, and then, when the afternoon had settled into early evening, he returned to where Oder's body lay with a machete, the same machete he had told his mother he was taking to cut bananas. He returned to the body and used it. The details of what he did next are among the most disturbing elements of an already profoundly disturbing case, and they speak to a mind that had untethered itself so completely from any external moral framework that even what the body means, what it represents, what it deserves, had ceased to carry ordinary weight. His mother noticed the blood on the machete when he returned. She said nothing conclusive about it. In the calcified silence of a family that had survived by not looking directly at things, questions were not always asked. The killings continued into the late summer and autumn. Each victim between 5 and 13 years old, never older. This was not arbitrary. 13 was, in Marcelo's theological understanding, the threshold. Children below it were guaranteed heaven. Above it, the soul was too compromised by the corruption of the world. He was not interested in teenagers. He was not interested in adults. His targets were always the very young, the very small, the very trusting. Children whose entire relationship with the world was still one of fundamental openness, who had not yet learned to assume that a smiling stranger's kindness had a cost attached to it. He varied his approach slightly with each encounter, but the architecture was always the same. Approach, engage, offer money or promise a ritual or suggest a small errand. Lead the boy to a remote location. A beach, a field, a stretch of wasteland between neighborhoods, and then the strangling. Always the strangling, though sometimes preceded by beating. The bodies were buried in shallow graves when possible, or simply left at the scene. He sometimes took trophies, a pair of shorts, an item of clothing, and carried them home the way a different kind of person might carry a photograph. The 7th, 8th, 9th victim. October now. The Guanabara Bay wind carrying the first slight suggestion of a different season, and Marcelo still moving through Atabarai and its surrounding neighborhoods with the ease of a man who has never been challenged. He had, by this point, established a kind of grim internal confidence. Not arrogance, not the recklessness that catches killers, but something quieter. A sense that this was simply what his life was. The job at the shop, the church broadcasts, the occasional murder, the ongoing project of sending souls to paradise. The families of his victims were not silent. They were not passive. They went to police stations and described their missing sons, gave physical descriptions, reported the last known locations of their children. Several complaints about a quietly spoken man who approached young boys with money and stories about religious rituals did reach investigators during this period. But in a city processing hundreds of violent deaths per week, the reports were not connected. The dots existed, but no one had yet drawn the line between them. November, the 10th, 11th, 12th victim. The days shortening, the noise of approaching Christmas beginning to fill the streets of Rio with its particular brand of chaos. The competing sounds of celebration and desperation, fireworks and domestic arguments, the smell of street food and open drains. Marcelo went to church on Sundays. He sang. He prayed. He listened to the bishop's words about heaven and the innocence of children, and he nodded, privately, in agreement. He was, by his own assessment, a faithful man, a gentle man, a man doing something difficult because it needed to be done. The 13th boy. And then, on December 11th, 1991, Marcelo made the acquaintance of two brothers, and this encounter would be his last. Their names were Altair and Ivan. Altair was 10 years old. Ivan was 6. They were brothers in the way that poor children in hard neighborhoods are brothers. Close with the particular closeness of two people who understand that they are each other's primary resource, each other's warmth in the cold, each other's witness in a world that does not otherwise pay much attention. On December 11th, 1991, the two boys had been promised lunch by a neighbor. They set out together, as they always moved. Side by side, Ivan slightly behind, the way younger siblings trail their elders with complete trust. They encountered Marcelo on the way. He was, as always, pleasant. He crouched down to their level as he had crouched down for 14 children before them, and he made his offer. For 1,000 cruzeros, a sum that, in the collapsing economy of 1991 Brazil, felt significant to a 10-year-old boy trying to navigate the world, in exchange for their help with a Catholic ritual. Something simple, something nearby, nothing to be afraid of. Altair looked at this quiet, smiling man and made the calculation that children in difficult circumstances sometimes make. That the promise was real, that the man was safe, that the money was worth following him for. He took Ivan's hand. They went. Marcelo led them to a remote beach, a stretch of shoreline away from the populated areas, where the sound of waves covered other sounds and the absence of witnesses was guaranteed. What happened there moved quickly and without warning. Marcelo turned to 6-year-old Ivan. He wrapped his hands around the small boy's throat and he strangled him, right there, in front of his 10-year-old brother. Ivan died on that beach as Altair watched, frozen in a terror so complete it removed the capacity for movement or sound. After Ivan was dead, Marcelo sexually violated the child's body. Altair stood, watching, paralyzed. And then Marcelo looked at Altair, and in that moment Altair understood, with the survival instinct that sometimes cuts through even complete psychological shock, that his only path forward was compliance. Absolute, unchallenging compliance. He could not fight. He could not run. Not yet, not with Marcelo watching him, with nowhere near enough distance between them. So Altair did something that required a kind of courage that most adults will never be asked to produce. He stayed calm. He obeyed whatever Marcelo said. He did not scream. He did not run. He endured the night. Marcelo did not kill Altair that night. Whether this was a moment of hesitation, a miscalculation, a break in the pattern, or something else entirely, the record does not fully explain. What it does tell us is that he kept Altair with him, not at the beach but moving until eventually they reached Copacabana, where Marcelo had his regular job distributing flyers. On the morning of December 12th, Marcelo went about his work on Copacabana Beach, handing out flyers to passers-by with the practiced normalcy of a man who had done this hundreds of times, and for a period, perhaps an hour, perhaps longer, his attention was divided between the job and the boy. That moment of divided attention was all Altair needed. He ran. He ran the way 10-year-old boys run when death has just touched everything they know. The way people run when the distance between where they are and where they need to be feels like the only thing that matters in the entire world. He ran until he found safety, until he found adults who would listen, until he found someone who, when a traumatized 10-year-old told them what had happened, believed him. Altair did not, at first, tell everything. The full weight of what he had witnessed. The murder of his 6-year-old brother on a beach, the violation that followed, came out in stages as it often does with child survivors of extreme violence. The initial report was fragmentary, but it was enough. Investigators followed the thread. They asked where Ivan was. And then, the next day, Altair told them everything. Ivan's body was found at the beach. The subsequent examination confirmed that the child had been strangled and sexually violated. It also confirmed something else, something that briefly puzzled investigators. Ivan's small hands had been carefully tucked inside his own shorts. In the chaos of everything else, someone had taken the time to do this. When police asked Marcelo about it later, he explained, without being asked to elaborate. He had gone back to the crime scene after leaving Altair and returned Ivan's hands to his shorts so that the rats would not gnaw his fingers. He had committed murder. He had violated a 6-year-old child. And then he had returned in the dark, with whatever strange tenderness lived alongside the violence inside him, to protect the boy's hands from rats. The investigation moved to Marcelo quickly. He had established enough of a pattern in the neighborhood. The quiet man who offered money, who spoke of Catholic rituals, who led boys away, that connecting him to Altair's account did not require extraordinary detective work. More than anything, it required someone finally looking. Someone finally drawing the line between reports that had been sitting separately in different precincts, waiting for a moment of attention that the chaos of Rio de Janeiro had not, until now, provided. On December 18, 1991, investigators found Marcelo at his place of work in Copacabana. He was, by all accounts, completely calm when they approached. He had maintained his full daily routine since the murders of Ivan and the 14 children before him. Going to work, attending church, living at home with his mother and brothers in Itaboraí. There had been no attempt to flee, no change in behavior, no visible anxiety. When officers identified themselves and told him he needed to come with them, Marcelo Costa de Andrade looked at them with an expression of mild recognition and said what would become one of the most chilling lines in Brazilian criminal history. "I thought you would come yesterday." He had expected them. He simply had not been in any particular hurry. At the station, the confession came fully and without apparent resistance. Marcelo described each killing in detail, the approach, the specific location, the method, the return trips, the trophies. 14 murders. Not 12, not 10, 14 confirmed. Described with the recall of a man for whom these events had not been fugue states or psychotic breaks but deliberate, remembered acts carried out with full awareness. He showed no distress discussing them. He answered questions cooperatively, providing investigators with locations of buried remains, details of methods, descriptions of victims. He guided police to sites where other bodies had been disposed of, spending hours leading investigators through the terrain of his killing season with the patience of a man trying to be helpful. What he would not concede was wrongdoing. At no point during the confession, not once in the hours and days of interrogation that followed, did Marcelo express remorse. He expressed, instead, a kind of earnest conviction that he had been misunderstood. He kept returning to it, the theology, the certainty, the children in heaven. He needed investigators to understand that what he had done was not cruelty, that it required a kind of courage, actually, that someone had to care enough about these forgotten children to act, that he had cared. Brazil heard this, and for a moment, the entire country held its collective breath in something that was not quite silence, something rawer than that. The confession broke in early 1992, and the media descended with the particular ferocity of a press that had found not just a killer, but a killer who made no sense. The vampire of Niterói. The name spread first through newspapers, then through radio, then through the specific horror-fascinated conversation of a nation that had thought it understood its own darkness and now realized it did not. The legal proceedings against Marcelo Costa de Andrade moved forward under the weight of a confession so detailed and so freely given that establishing what had happened was never in serious question. What remained deeply and profoundly in question was what Marcelo Costa de Andrade was. Whether he existed in the moral and psychological category of a man who could be held criminally responsible, or whether what had occurred inside him during those 9 months constituted something the law had a different classification for entirely. Forensic psychiatrists were brought in. Evaluators examined him, his history, his cognition, his capacity to understand the nature and wrongfulness of his acts. What they found was not a man who did not know what he had done. Marcelo knew precisely what he had done. He could describe every detail, sequence every event, recall each victim with an accuracy that demonstrated full cognitive engagement throughout. What he lacked entirely structurally, as if the architecture of that understanding had simply never been built, was any comprehension that these actions were wrong. Not suppressed guilt, not buried remorse. The capacity itself appeared genuinely absent, replaced by the alternative moral framework that his church attendance and his particular psychology had constructed, one in which killing children was a form of mercy and the murders were, at their core, acts of love. On April 26, 1993, Marcelo Costa de Andrade was formally declared legally insane. He was not sentenced to prison. He was committed indefinitely to the Heitor Cariu Psychiatric Hospital in Niterói, Rio de Janeiro. The judicial system concluded that conventional punishment served no meaningful purpose for a man who did not experience his actions as punishable. What the system could do was confine him, evaluate him, and prevent him from continuing. The families of the 14 victims received no verdict in the traditional sense. There was no sentencing, no moment of formal reckoning where the weight of what had been taken from them was acknowledged by a court in the language of years and consequences. There was a finding of insanity and an admission to a hospital. For parents who had filed missing persons reports that sat in stacks, for mothers who had gone to police stations again and again, for siblings who had watched their brothers vanish into the ordinary noise of a city too overwhelmed to notice, this was the conclusion. A psychiatric commitment, a hospital room, the knowledge that the man who had done these things was alive and housed and fed while their sons were not. Marcelo settled into institutional life at Aitor Cariu with the same placid cooperativeness he had shown throughout his confession. He followed the hospital's rules. He was not violent within the facility. He was, by clinical accounts, a model patient in the purely behavioral sense, compliant, manageable, unremarkable in his daily conduct. He was evaluated annually, as required by Brazilian law for indefinitely committed patients, and year after year the evaluation returned the same finding. He remained insane in the clinical sense that the law recognized. He remained committed, and he remained, in his own mind, entirely innocent. In November of 2001, a decade after his arrest, forensic psychiatrist Dr. Helen Morrison, an American profiler known for her work on some of the most studied criminal minds in the world, traveled to Brazil specifically to interview Marcelo Costa de Andrade. Through an interpreter, across a table in the psychiatric facility that had been his world for the better part of 10 years, she posed the question that everyone wanted answered and that no one had yet received a satisfying answer to: why? His response was patient, almost gentle. The children, he explained, had bad lives. The favela was a place of suffering. He knew because he had lived it. If they were young enough when they died, they went to heaven. A better place, he said. He had sent them to a better place. The logic was complete, circular, and to Marcelo utterly incontrovertible. Dr. Morrison, who had interviewed some of the most notorious killers in American and international criminal history, would later recount the experience as one that stayed with her. Not because Marcelo was the most violent person she had ever encountered, but because of the quality of his certainty. Most killers, even those who construct elaborate justifications for their acts, betray somewhere in the interview. A flicker, a shift, a moment where the internal architecture shows its instability. Marcelo showed none of it. He did not perform his belief. He simply held it the way anyone holds a fact about the world that requires no defense. Brazil changed in the aftermath of the Vampire of Niterói case, though not as completely or as quickly as the scale of the horror demanded. The case accelerated public conversation about the systematic vulnerability of street children, about the extermination squads that had been operating in plain sight, about the police indifference that had allowed 14 murders to go undetected for 9 months, about what it meant that a man could kill 14 children and only be caught because one of them survived and ran. Politicians made speeches. Advocacy organizations received attention they had been seeking for years. The debate about mental illness and criminal responsibility in the Brazilian legal system sharpened briefly into something close to a national conversation. Then, as national conversations do, it moved on. The 14 boys did not move on. They exist now only in records and in the memories of families that have spent decades carrying the particular grief of losses that were never properly acknowledged by the system that failed to prevent them. Oder José Muniz dos Santos, 11 years old, killed near a football pitch. Anderson Gomez Goulart, 11 years old, whose blood was collected and consumed. Ivan, 6 years old, murdered on a beach in front of his older brother while the waves covered the sound. And 11 others, boys with names and faces and lives that were in the process of being built when Marcelo Costa de Andrade decided to end them. Altair Medeiros de Abreu, the 10-year-old who ran, who survived, who gave investigators the thread that unraveled everything, carried what he had witnessed forward into a life the public has never been fully allowed to see. He was 10 years old on the night his 6-year-old brother was murdered in front of him. Whatever shape the years since then have taken for him, the record does not say. He deserves more than a footnote. He deserves to be remembered as what he was: a child who witnessed something unspeakable and found, in the middle of it, a way to survive. At the Aitor Kariu Psychiatric Hospital, the annual evaluations continued. Year after year, through the late 90s, through the 2000s, through the changing decades, Marcelo Costa de Andrade was assessed and assessed again, and each time the conclusion was the same. He was still there. He was still calm. He was still, in every conversation with every examiner, absolutely certain that the children were in heaven, that he had helped them, that the world had misunderstood a compassionate act as a violent one. He aged inside the institution. The boy from Rocinha who had been beaten and abused and sold and discarded, who had absorbed the theology of supernatural forces and built from it a justification for atrocity, grew old in a hospital room in Niterói while the city outside his window continued to be exactly what it had always been, beautiful and brutal and indifferent to its smallest, most forgotten lives. There is a version of this story that ends with a lesson, a clear moral drawn, a system corrected, an acknowledgement extracted from the machinery of society that it had failed and would do better. That version is tidier than the truth. The truth is that the conditions Marcelo exploited, the invisibility of favela children, the overwhelmed police infrastructure, the systemic indifference to deaths in poor neighborhoods, did not evaporate when his name appeared in newspapers. The extermination squads did not immediately stop. The children did not suddenly acquire the protection they deserved. The slums remained the slums. What remained and remains is the case itself. The record, the confession, the 14 names, the one survivor, and the man in the hospital room who still, according to every account available, believes he did nothing wrong. Who wakes each morning in the facility that has housed him for decades, cooperative and quiet and mild-mannered, certain in the way that only the truly lost can be certain, that somewhere above the city that made him and the slums that shaped him and the church that twisted what was left, 14 small boys are at peace, and that this peace is, at least in part, his gift to them. That is the true crime case of Marcelo Costa de Andrade, the vampire of Niterói, the angel butcher of the favela. A man who did not believe he was a monster, a man who believed, with every cell of his being, that he was the only person who had ever truly cared, and that, perhaps more than the blood, more than the bodies, more than the machete or the shallow graves or the 14 deaths, is the thing that will follow you out of this story and into the dark. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Clown Who Killed in the Dark. The case of Pedro Costa de Oliveira, a.k.a. Pedro Palhaco, the strangling clown of Rio Grande do Sul. He painted his face to make children laugh. But when the lights went out and a woman said no, something ancient and merciless woke up inside him. And the only thing left when morning came was a body that would never speak again. There are monsters that live in shadows, ones we imagine lurking in alleyways or behind locked doors, ones that fiction has trained us to recognize. Cold-eyed, hollow, obvious. But Pedro Costa de Oliveira was not that kind of monster. He was the kind that handed you a smile first. The kind that worked beside ordinary men, drank in ordinary bars, and moved through the world wearing the mask of someone utterly unremarkable. He had once made crowds roar with laughter beneath a circus tent, his painted face gleaming under warm golden lights while children pointed and clapped and felt completely safe. That was the cruelest part of who he was. Not the darkness alone, but the lightness he used to conceal it. Because when a woman denied him, when she refused to submit to the twisted corners of his desires, the laughter stopped. The costume came off, and what remained was not a clown at all. What remained was a strangler, patient, deliberate, and utterly without remorse. This is the story of a man who spent 30 years cycling in and out of prison, who was warned against by psychiatrists, who was released anyway, and who killed again the moment the world gave him the chance. This is the story of Pedro Palhaco, and it is far more disturbing than anything he ever performed under the big top. The city of Camaquã sits quietly in the southern Brazilian state of Rio Grande do Sul, a place of flat land, wide skies, and communities where everybody knows everybody's name. It is not a place that would naturally produce a name remembered in the annals of crime. And yet, sometime in the year 1896, the exact date lost to the casual record-keeping of the era, a boy named Pedro Costa de Oliveira entered the world there, the only child of Florencio Ramos, a Brazilian man, and Maria José de Araújo, a woman of Paraguayan descent. We do not know much about his early childhood. History has not preserved the texture of those early years. Whether there was warmth in his home, whether there was cruelty, whether the boy who would one day become Brazil's strangling clown was molded by some specific wound or simply born carrying something already broken inside him. What we do know is that he left, early, long before most young men would consider abandoning the home they grew up in. Pedro Costa de Oliveira walked away from his parents and joined a traveling circus. He became a clown. Think about what that means for a moment. A clown's entire purpose is performance. It is deception of the most cheerful kind. You paint a smile on your face regardless of what churns beneath it. You exaggerate, you distort, you manufacture emotion for an audience. Every single day, Pedro Costa de Oliveira practiced the art of showing the world a face that was not his own. Every single day, he perfected the skill of making people feel comfortable around him while concealing whatever truly lived behind his eyes. For years, the circus was his world. The smell of sawdust and canvas, the noise of crowds, the rhythm of travel, city to city, town to town, never settling, never building anything lasting. There is something both fascinating and unsettling about a man who gravitates toward a life of perpetual motion and disguise. It suits a person who cannot or will not be truly known. And Pedro, it would later become terrifyingly clear, was a person who did not want to be known at all. At some point in the early 1920s, the circus life ended. Perhaps the work dried up, perhaps something shifted, perhaps the road simply ran out. Whatever the reason, Pedro Costa de Oliveira left the traveling show and found himself in the city of Montenegro, Rio Grande do Sul, where he secured employment as a stoker's assistant for the Rio Grande do Sul State Railroad Company. It was honest labor, physical, demanding, unremarkable. He was, to all outward appearances, a working man who had settled down, trading the painted costumes of circus life for the soot and steam of the railways. But settling down is not the same as becoming stable. And for a man like Pedro, the surface calm was only ever a temporary condition. Something that held until it didn't. Until a woman said the wrong word. Until a refusal cracked the thin shell of normalcy and let out whatever had always been waiting inside him. August 28, 1922. That is the date that history records as the beginning of Pedro Costa de Oliveira's documented reign of violence. Though one can only wonder whether it was truly his first act of darkness or simply the first one that left a body behind. On that evening, Pedro went to a local bar in Montenegro with a friend, a man named Afonso Pedro Borges. The two men were not alone for long. At some point during the evening, they fell into the company of two teenage girls. Erice Ferreo, 16 years old, and her companion Maria de Gloria, also a young woman of similar age. The night was social, easy, the kind of evening that feels entirely ordinary in the moment. Drinks were shared. Conversation passed between them. The hours moved along as they do when people are gathered together in the warm, forgiving light of a bar at night. When the group eventually parted ways, Pedro did not go directly home. Instead, he took a detour with Aracy Ferreo, the 16-year-old girl who had laughed and talked with him over drinks just hours before. They moved together toward a small forested area near the local railroad station, the kind of place that offers privacy, the kind of place that city streets on summer nights always seem to have tucked somewhere in their edges. What happened there, in the darkness beneath those trees, is as horrifying as anything recorded in the annals of Brazilian crime history. The following day, Aracy Ferreo's body was discovered. She had been strangled to death. But the killing itself was not the full extent of what had been done to her. Her body had been mutilated, the specific nature of which spoke to a depravity that went far beyond the act of murder. A piece of wood had been inserted into her genitalia. She was 16 years old. She had been out at a bar with her friend, laughing and young and utterly unaware that the man sitting across from her was capable of something like this. The crime scene told investigators a story, and that story pointed in one very clear direction. Pedro Costa de Oliveira had visible scratches on his body, the kind that human fingernails leave when a person fights for their life. Aracy Ferreo had fought him. She had clawed at him with everything she had in those final moments, and her resistance had marked him. On top of that, his clothing bore bloodstains that he had evidently attempted to wash away, the kind of desperate, inadequate effort that speaks to panic washing in after violence. He had tried to erase the evidence. He had failed. 2 days after the body was found, Pedro Costa de Oliveira was arrested and charged with the murder of Aracy Ferreo. He was 36 years old. The former circus clown who had made people laugh for years was now sitting in a police station, his scratched face and blood-stained conscience laid bare before investigators who had little difficulty connecting him to the crime. The trial moved forward with a weight that such cases carry. The gravity of a young girl's life extinguished in a forest, the community of Montenegro shaken to its core, the terrible gap between the ordinary man people thought they knew and the thing he had revealed himself to be. On January 19, 1923, the court delivered its verdict. Pedro Costa de Oliveira was found guilty on all counts related to the murder of Aracy Ferreo. His sentence, 25 years and 6 months imprisonment, to be served at a prison in the city of Porto Alegre. 25 years and 6 months, for a girl strangled in a forest, for mutilation, for the snuffing out of a 16-year-old life on a summer night in Montenegro. The sentence was what the law of the time permitted and required, and Pedro was transported to Porto Alegre to begin serving it. Inside the prison walls, he was just another inmate. There is no record to suggest he caused extraordinary trouble, no accounts of exceptional violence within the institution. He existed. He passed through the years in the way that imprisoned men do, slowly, in a world reduced to walls and routines and the distant, abstract idea of life on the outside. He served his time, and the world, as worlds tend to do, slowly moved on. But history was not finished with Pedro Costa de Oliveira. Not even close. By April 13, 1934, something shifted in his situation. He had been in prison for over a decade, and the system, perhaps persuaded by good behavior, perhaps simply following procedure, assigned him to community service outside the prison walls. He was put to work helping to construct the Gravataí-Taqua Highway, and in connection with this assignment, he was given a small house in an area called Chácara das Bananeiras. He was no longer fully incarcerated. He was partially free, moving between the controlled environment of labor and the loosely supervised space of his temporary residence. This is where the story should have proceeded with caution. This is where every instinct of self-preservation that a community possesses should have been sharpened and alert. Because Pedro Costa de Oliveira was not a man who had been changed by prison. He was not a man who had been reformed, or who had confronted the darkness inside himself and dismantled it. He was a man who had simply been contained for a while. And like all things that are contained without being cured, he was still exactly what he had always been, waiting in the particular way that predators wait for an opportunity. The years passed. The highway work continued. Pedro existed in this in-between state, not quite free, not quite imprisoned, while the city of Porto Alegre hummed around him, indifferent to what it was harboring. And then came October 18th, 1939. A date that should make every person who had signed off on his partial freedom feel the cold weight of what that decision had enabled. On that day, Pedro Costa de Oliveira crossed paths with a woman named Rosalina Augusta Santana. She was 50 years old, and she was, by his own later account, an old acquaintance, someone he had known before, someone familiar enough that their encounter did not immediately raise alarm for her. They spoke. They talked the way old acquaintances do, the easy, comfortable exchange of people who share some history. And at some point in that conversation, Pedro Costa de Oliveira persuaded her to have sex with him. They agreed to go somewhere private, a vacant lot on Vega Street in the Pardinon neighborhood of Porto Alegre, place out of sight. What happened next was a horror that followed a pattern already written in blood years earlier in a forest near Montenegro. Once they were alone, away from the eyes and ears of anyone who might intervene, Pedro revealed the specific nature of what he wanted from her. His sexual fetishes, the details of which psychiatrists would later describe as the fixations of a sadist, were laid before Rosalina Augusta Santana, and she refused. She said no. She looked at this man and decided that what he was asking of her was something she would not give. That refusal cost her everything. The rage that followed her rejection was immediate and overwhelming. Rosalina fought back. She scratched at him with the fierce, desperate energy of a woman who understands, on some animal level, that she is in mortal danger. Her fingernails found his skin and left marks that would later become evidence. But Pedro Costa de Oliveira was stronger, or more relentless, or simply more committed to the terrible outcome he had decided upon. He overpowered her. He wrapped his hands around her throat. And he strangled Rosalina Augusta Santana to death on that vacant lot in Pardinon, beneath the open sky of an October afternoon. And then, and this is the part that caused investigators and psychiatrists to use words like instinctive pervert and necrophiliac in their official reports, he did not flee. He did not panic and run. He did something to that woman's body that transformed this case from a murder investigation into something considerably more disturbing. He had sex with her corpse. When Rosalina's body was discovered, investigators found something beneath her fingernails, fragments of skin, biological evidence of the struggle she had mounted, the fight she had waged in her final moments. That skin matched Pedro Costa de Oliveira. Combined with the scratches visible on his face, the case against him assembled itself with terrible efficiency. He was arrested not long after. He confessed. The confession earned him an additional 21 years of imprisonment, layered on top of whatever remained of his original sentence. He was returned to prison. And this time, the institution held him for years, long enough that by 1946, the prison's anthropological office decided that something more formal was needed. A proper reckoning with what exactly Pedro Costa de Oliveira was. They ordered a psychiatric evaluation. For 4 months, psychiatrists observed him. They studied him, assessed him, probed the architecture of his psychology with the tools available to Brazilian forensic science in the mid-20th century. And when those 4 months were done, their conclusion was not ambiguous. It was not hedged with professional caution or softened by uncertainty. They declared, in the precise and damning language of their report, that Pedro Costa de Oliveira was an instinctive pervert, a sadist, and a necrophiliac. They stated clearly that he posed a high and ongoing risk to anyone who came into contact with him. They recommended strongly, without reservation, that he not be released under any circumstances. The Anthropological Office's board backed this finding completely. It was, in every professional and institutional sense, a unanimous conclusion. This man must remain imprisoned. And for a while it held. The recommendation carried weight. The years continued. Pedro Costa de Oliveira aged inside the prison, one leg eventually taken from him by infection in 1957, his body deteriorating as bodies do in long confinement. He was not going anywhere, or so everyone believed. There is a particular kind of institutional failure that does not announce itself loudly. It does not come with alarm bells or public scandal. It moves quietly through bureaucratic channels, dressed in the language of legal procedure and judicial discretion. And by the time anyone realizes the magnitude of what has been permitted, it is already too late. The release of Pedro Costa de Oliveira in June of 1950 was exactly that kind of failure, slow, procedural, and catastrophic. Here is how it happened. In 1948, Pedro Costa de Oliveira, now a man well into his 50s and carrying the full weight of decades in prison, filed a request for parole. His legal argument was not complex. He pointed to a provision of state law, one that explicitly stated prisoners should serve a maximum of 30 years of their sentence. He had, by that point, been incarcerated for the better part of 3 decades. On the face of the legal text, his argument had ground to stand on. His appeals were processed. They moved through the system the way legal documents move, slowly, with stops along the way, with denials stacking up as various courts and offices reviewed the case and remembered who, precisely, they were being asked to release. Time and again, the request was turned down. The memory of 2 dead women, the psychiatric evaluations, the clinical warnings, all of it served as a wall against his petitions. But walls, in bureaucracy, are only as solid as the last person who reviews them. And when Pedro's case finally reached the Federal Superior Court of Brazil, it landed in front of Justice Dionísio Lima da Silva. The psychiatrists had been clear. The institutional record had been clear. The behavioral history of Pedro Costa de Oliveira had been clear for nearly 3 decades. None of that clarity mattered to Justice Lima da Silva. Despite the formal protests of the psychiatric team that had assessed Pedro just 4 years earlier, despite the institutional recommendation that he remain imprisoned without exception, Justice Lima da Silva granted the parole request. On June 7, 1950, Pedro Costa de Oliveira walked out of prison. He was approximately 54 years old. The psychiatrists who had spent 4 months studying him, who had assembled their findings into a report that left no room for misinterpretation, had their professional judgment overturned by a single judicial signature. The man they described as an instinctive pervert and sadist, a necrophiliac who posed a high risk to those around him, was now free to walk the streets of Rio Grande do Sul. This was not a failure of evidence. This was not a failure of professional expertise. This was a failure of a system that allowed one man's legal interpretation to supersede the collective, informed judgment of medical specialists who had looked this killer directly in the eye. Pedro Costa de Oliveira relocated to the Jardim Floresta neighborhood of Porto Alegre. He settled in, found a small house, established something resembling a domestic existence. To the people around him, he was perhaps simply an old man who had done time, the kind of figure that neighborhoods in large cities absorb without too much ceremony. He was not a celebrity of crime. He was not notorious to his neighbors. He was just Pedro, just a man. Except that he was not just a man. He was exactly what the psychiatrists had said he was. And the proof of that would come on a night that, for many Brazilians, carries the particular weight of religious significance. Easter Sunday, April 13th, 1952. Easter Sunday, a night when families gather, when churches fill, when the air carries something ceremonial and sacred. Pedro Costa de Oliveira spent that night doing what he apparently preferred, moving from bar to bar in Porto Alegre, drinking his way through the evening with the purposeful ease of a man who had nowhere particular to be. At some point during that night's wandering, he encountered a woman named Universina Alves Maria de Almeida. She was 43 years old, a local saleswoman who moved through the city peddling combs and small domestic objects, the kind of woman who made her living through daily, modest commerce. She had a past of her own, a history marked by hardship and survival and the kind of life that left calluses on a person. She was, by the time she crossed Pedro's path on that Easter night, a woman who had navigated decades of difficult living. None of that survival, none of those decades of endurance, would protect her from what Pedro Costa de Oliveira had already decided he intended to do. He drank with her. He spoke with her. He charmed her or persuaded her or simply wore her resistance down through the patient persistence of a man who understood how alcohol and conversation could soften a person's defenses. By the end of the night, He had convinced Universina to come back to his house with him for sex. She agreed. They walked through the quiet streets of Jardim Floresta together, the city still and dark around them, Easter Sunday fading toward midnight. They went inside. And then, in the privacy of his house, Pedro Costa de Oliveira did what he had done before, what he had done in a forest near Montenegro 30 years earlier, what he had done on a vacant lot in Partinan 11 years before that. He revealed himself. He told this woman what he wanted. He laid his fetishes before her with the particular boldness of a man who has lived inside his own compulsions for so long that they feel normal to him, who has reduced other human beings to instruments of his own need and expects, at some fundamental level, that the world will cooperate. Universina Alves Maria de Almeida said no. That word, that simple, complete, entirely reasonable word, was her death sentence. The anger that rose in Pedro Costa de Oliveira at being denied was instantaneous and absolute. He moved on her with the cold violence of someone who had done this before, someone for whom the translation from rejection to attack required no internal deliberation. He wrapped his hands around her throat, the same hands that had strangled Erice Ferreo in 1922, the same hands that had choked Rosalina Santana in 1939, and he squeezed until Universina Alves Maria de Almeida was dead. She was 43 years old. She had been trying to sell combs for a living. She had said no to a man who could not accept the word. And now she was gone. But Pedro was not done. Just as he had done with Rosalina Santana 13 years before, he did not simply kill her and panic. He violated her body. He committed acts upon her corpse that reflect the deepest, most disturbing aspects of the psychological portrait the psychiatrists had assembled. The sadism, the necrophilia, the complete reduction of another human being to something less than human in his own warped understanding of the world. When he was finished, he did not call anyone. He did not surrender himself to the shock and guilt that most people would experience after taking a human life. He threw her naked body into a well on his property. There is something particularly chilling about that detail. Not the spontaneous violence of the killing itself, horrifying as it is, but the calculated, cold-blooded act that followed. Throwing her body into a well required thought. It required a decision about concealment. It required Pedro Costa de Oliveira to look at the dead woman he had just violated and make a deliberate reasoned choice about how best to hide what he had done. This was not panic. This was planning. This was a man who had killed before and understood that the aftermath required management. He disposed of her. And then, apparently, he left, disappeared from the house, went somewhere unknown, while Universina Alves Maria de Almeida lay at the bottom of a well in the property's yard. The discovery of her body came through the most heartbreaking and random of avenues. On April 26th, almost 2 weeks after Easter Sunday, the property manager came to the house to check on some crops. He brought his small daughter with him, a child along for an ordinary errand on an ordinary morning. The little girl, as children do, wandered and explored. She drifted toward the well on the property. And then she noticed it. Something at the bottom that was not simply water and darkness. Something that did not belong there. The initial assumption, before anyone looked too closely, was that the body might be Pedro's. He had been absent for days, and no one had seen him. But when the body was carefully removed from that well, it was not the decomposing remains of an old ex-convict that investigators found. It was a woman. It was Universina Alves Maria de Almeida. The police moved fast. They raided the house. What they found inside confirmed what they already, on some terrible level, understood. Dried bloodstains marked the floor. Blood-stained clothing and bedsheets had been left behind. And then there was something else. Something that painted a portrait of Pedro Costa de Oliveira that was simultaneously pathetic and deeply disturbing. Numerous photographs were found in the house. They depicted various people engaged in explicit sexual acts. The collection spoke to a man whose inner world was dominated by compulsions he had never restrained, never addressed, never sought help for. He had surrounded himself with these materials, living inside a world shaped entirely by his own depraved appetite. A warrant was issued for his arrest. He was caught mere hours after the discovery. The old man, the former clown, the 3-time strangler, found somewhere in Porto Alegre, having apparently made little effort to flee the city entirely. Maybe he was tired. Maybe, after 3 murders and decades of imprisonment and 1 leg lost to infection, whatever engine drove him had simply begun to stall. He was brought in. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The bloodstains, the photographs, the biological material, the witness who had seen them together the night of Easter Sunday. The case assembled itself around him with the terrible completeness of a story that had always been going to end this way. Universina's identity had to be formally established. The press initially referred to the victim as Sueli, a misidentification that took 4 days to correct. When her true identity was confirmed, investigators learned more about who she had been. She was the daughter of a Brazilian father and an Uruguayan mother. She had a twin sister. She had run away from home at 13 to be with an older man. In 1924, when she was 24 years old, she had killed her second lover with a hatchet and served a prison sentence before being released in 1932. She had then settled in Porto Alegre, where her drinking had become notable enough that locals had nicknamed her home the Drunken Castle. She was a complicated person with a complicated past, a survivor in her own right, someone who had endured her own violence, who had committed her own. None of that complexity made her death less of a crime. None of her history made Pedro Costa de Oliveira less of a monster. She had said no. That was the only thing that mattered to him. That was the only thing that had mattered to any of the women he killed. And for each of them, that one act of self-determination had been fatal. By the time Pedro Costa de Oliveira was brought before the courts for the 3rd and final time, he was carrying the accumulated weight of 30 years of documented violence. He was a man who had stood in a courtroom before twice, and had heard sentences pronounced against him that should, by any reasonable standard, have kept him away from the world permanently. And yet here he was again, the same man, the same pattern, a different victim, a different date, the same outcome. The trial for the murder of Universina Alves Maria de Almeida was not a case burdened by ambiguity or shortage of proof. The evidence against Pedro was described as overwhelming by those who reviewed it. The bloodstains in the house, the photographs found on the premises, the biological evidence, the witness accounts placing him with the victim on the night of Easter Sunday, the body in the well, his own history written clearly in the court records of 1923 and 1939, 2 previous convictions for the murder and sexual violation of women who had refused his demands, a pattern so clearly established, so precisely repeated, that it required no interpretation. The prosecution did not need to build a narrative from scattered pieces. The narrative built itself. Pedro Costa de Oliveira had a methodology. He had a trigger. He had demonstrated both in documented, legally recorded detail across 3 decades. He met women. He charmed them or persuaded them. He got them alone. He asked for something they would not give him. And then he killed them, and then he did to their bodies what the psychiatric team had described as the behavior of a sadist and necrophiliac. 3 times. The same arc, the same brutal conclusion across a span of 30 years. The verdict came down without surprise. Guilty. The sentence that followed was staggering in its arithmetic, though perhaps not in its logic given the circumstances. For the murder of Universina Alves Maria de Almeida, Pedro Costa de Oliveira was sentenced to 84 years imprisonment. Let that number settle for a moment. 84 years. For one murder. Added to the 25.5 years from 1923 and the 21 years from the Santana case, his total accumulated sentencing reached a figure that no one in the courtroom could have expected a human being to outlive. 130 years. Pedro Costa de Oliveira was sentenced to 130 years in Brazilian prison, making his case one of the longest sentences ever recorded in the state of Rio Grande do Sul at that time and arguably in Brazilian criminal history up to that point. It was a number that existed less as a practical expectation and more as a statement. A declaration by the legal system that this man should never, under any circumstances, be given another opportunity to stand within arm's reach of a living woman. The courts had learned, with a slowness and cost that is almost unbearable to contemplate, what the psychiatrists had known since 1946. Pedro Costa de Oliveira was not a man who could be released. Not for any reason. Not on any grounds. Not under any interpretation of law or mercy or rehabilitative possibility. The irony, if irony is even the right word for something so laced with tragedy, is that the psychiatrists had said exactly this. In 1946, after 4 months of observation and evaluation, they had delivered their conclusion with complete clarity. He is an instinctive pervert. He is a sadist. He is a necrophiliac. He poses a high risk. He should not be released under any circumstances. The institutional board agreed. Every professional whose job it was to assess the danger of Pedro Costa de Oliveira had looked at him and arrived at the same answer. And then one judge had set him free. Justice Dionisio Lima da Silva, the federal superior court judge who granted the parole in 1950, had overturned the collective expertise of trained psychiatric professionals on the basis of a statutory interpretation. Technically, legally, Pedro had the right to seek parole after 30 years. The law said so. But the law, as it existed in that moment and as interpreted by that particular judge, did not adequately account for what happens when legal technicality and psychiatric reality are in direct conflict. The technicality won. The psychiatric reality was ignored. And Universina Alves Maria de Almeida died at the bottom of a well as the consequence of that judicial decision. This is not a hypothetical connection. This is not retrospective reasoning applied unfairly. The psychiatrists had explicitly stated before Pedro was released that he would kill again if freed. They had used precise clinical language to communicate a clear and concrete danger. That communication was overridden. That danger materialized within 2 years of his release. The sequence is as direct and damning as anything in this entire case. Inside the courtroom, as the 130-year sentence was pronounced, Pedro Costa de Oliveira would have been in his mid-50s. An aging man, physically diminished by decades of imprisonment, one leg already beginning the slow deterioration that would eventually require amputation. He did not have 130 years left in his body. He did not have 40. What the sentence represented was not a genuine expectation of time served but a legal monument to the harm he had done. A way of saying in numbers what words about monsters sometimes fail to capture. The press of the era took note. Brazilian newspapers that had followed the case gave it the kind of attention that cases involving pattern killers and spectacularly long sentences naturally attract. Headlines described him as the strangler of women, the clown who killed. The nickname that had followed him since his circus days, Pedro Palhaco, Pedro the Clown, took on a darkness in print that its original coinage had never intended. What had been a light-hearted label for a man who made audiences laugh became, in the newspaper columns of 1952 and 1953, a title that carried revulsion and dread. Pedro the Clown, the smiling face and the strangler's hands. Journalists who covered the story and investigators who processed the evidence were confronted with the photographs found in his house. Their presence in his home told a story about the internal world of Pedro Costa de Oliveira that even 3 murders had not fully communicated. He had spent years accumulating these materials, surrounding himself with them in the private space of his residence. They represented the landscape of his obsession, the visual record of the fixations he had carried since long before he ever turned them on a living, breathing woman. He was not a man who had snapped under sudden pressure. He was not a man driven to violence by circumstance or desperation. He was a man who had cultivated his darkness over an entire lifetime, who had fed it and housed it and brought it with him wherever he went. Psychiatrists revisiting the case in the aftermath of Universina's murder had no new language to apply. Their 1946 assessment remained exactly accurate. Everything they had written about him had been confirmed in the worst possible way. The updated record simply added another layer to the portrait. A man who could not be changed, who had not been changed by prison, by age, by the loss of physical capacity, by the weight of accumulated years. Whatever it was that drove him was structural, built into him at a level that conventional incarceration could not reach. What does it mean to be that kind of person? What does it mean to carry a compulsion so absolute that its refusal by another human being triggers not embarrassment or withdrawal but lethal rage? The answer is not satisfying because the answer is that no external condition caused it and no external condition could cure it. Pedro Costa de Oliveira was not shaped by poverty alone, or by a terrible childhood alone, or by the rootlessness of circus life alone. These things may have been present. These things may have contributed. But the sadism, the necrophilia, the precise and repeating pattern of his crimes, these were not produced by circumstance. They were him. They were what he was. The press, in covering the case, often returned to the detail that struck most readers as the most disorienting: the circus, the clown, the man who had stood before crowds of laughing children, who had performed and entertained and generated delight. The dissonance between that image and the reality of Pedro's inner world was, and remains, one of the most genuinely unsettling aspects of his story, because it forces a confrontation with something that we would all prefer to be false: the idea that monsters are distinguishable. The idea that something in the face or the manner or the social presentation of a person like this will mark them clearly, will signal to the people around them what they truly are. Pedro Palhaco had performed before crowds. He had been liked. He had been, on some surface level, embedded in the social fabric of the communities he moved through: the circus, the railroad company, the bar on a summer night in Montenegro where a 16-year-old girl laughed and talked with him and had no idea what was going to happen when they stepped outside together. The mask was not metaphorical. He had literally worn one professionally for years. He understood better than most people how completely a face can lie. Inside the prison walls once more, this time under a sentence so astronomically long that there was no conceivable legal mechanism by which he could be released again, Pedro Costa de Oliveira aged. His body continued its slow collapse. The infection that would take his leg arrived in 1957, just 5 years into his final sentence. He submitted to the amputation. He continued to age. The world outside went on doing what the world does, and he remained inside the state penitentiary of Rio Grande do Sul, diminishing by degrees. The 130-year sentence he carried was not merely the largest of its kind recorded in the state at the time. It was a kind of institutional reckoning, the system's belated acknowledgement that every time it had let this man out, it had enabled horror. Every moment of freedom it had extended to him had been a window of danger for the women of Rio Grande do Sul. And somewhere inside those prison walls, the old clown, the strangler, the sadist, the man the psychiatrists had warned about in language that could not have been clearer, simply kept living. Years piling up, the sentence growing increasingly abstract against the reality of his aging body. He was one of the longest-serving inmates in the history of the state. He had been cycling in and out of incarceration since 1922. He had killed across 3 distinct decades. He had been released despite every professional recommendation against it. He had killed again within 2 years of that release, and now he sat in a cell that he would not leave until his body finally gave out. The final chapter of Pedro Costa de Oliveira's life is not one of dramatic confrontation or last-minute revelation. There is no deathbed confession that reshaped the understanding of what he was. There is no sudden remorse, no recorded moment of genuine reckoning. What there is, instead, is the long and grinding conclusion of a man who had spent most of his adult life inside prison walls. Aging, deteriorating, reduced ultimately to a one-legged inmate in a penitentiary in Porto Alegre, waiting for death with the same patience he had once waited for opportunity. He died in 1967. He was approximately 71 years old. The cause of death was recorded as cachexia, a condition of severe bodily wasting, the kind of slow systemic failure that comes at the end of long illness or prolonged physical deterioration. He died still serving his sentence. He died inside the state penitentiary of Rio Grande do Sul, where he had spent more of his years than anywhere else on earth. The exact date of his death is not preserved with precision. Records from the era were imperfect, institutional documentation incomplete. Even in death, Pedro Costa de Oliveira retained something of the slipperiness that had characterized his passage through the world, present, and yet not fully legible. A man who had moved through decades of documented violence and still managed to remain, in certain historical registers, only partially fixed in place. But he was gone. Finally, irrevocably, the strangling clown of Rio Grande do Sul, the man who had killed 3 women across 30 years, who had been warned against by psychiatrists and released anyway, who had immediately vindicated every fear that professional assessment had articulated. He was gone. And Rio Grande do Sul, whatever it made of the end of him, was safer for it. Now step back. Step back from the individual dates and the courtroom sentences and the specific horror of each murder, and look at the whole of what this case represents. Because the story of Pedro Costa de Oliveira is not simply the story of a killer. It is the story of a system, its failures, its overrides, its moments of catastrophic misjudgment, and what those failures cost real people. Consider what was known about this man. In 1922, he murdered and mutilated a 16-year-old girl. He was convicted and sentenced to prison. In 1939, while serving a partially suspended sentence and living in a house connected to his community service assignment, he met a woman and strangled her when she refused him, then violated her body. He was arrested and sentenced to additional years. In 1946, after nearly a quarter century in and out of the system, trained psychiatrists conducted a formal evaluation and arrived at a conclusion that was as clear as clinical language permits. Do not release this man. He is dangerous in ways that are structural, not situational. He will harm again. That recommendation was upheld by the institution. It was backed by the board. And then, in 1950, it was overturned by a judge who found a legal technicality and used it to open a cell door that should never have been opened. 2 years later, Universina Alves Maria de Almeida was at the bottom of a well on Easter Monday morning, and a little girl playing near the property was the one who found her. The psychiatrists were not surprised. They had said so in writing. Their language had not been ambiguous. And the tragedy, if a word that inadequate can even be applied to something this complete, is that being right about Pedro did nothing to protect his third victim. Being right, in this case, meant only that afterward there was a formal record confirming what everyone who mattered had already known and failed to act on. This is the part of true crime that gets too little attention. Not the evil of the individual criminal, which is real and documented and horrifying, but the mundane institutional decisions that create conditions for that evil to operate. Pedro Costa de Oliveira did not kill Universina Alves Maria de Almeida in isolation. He killed her as the direct, predictable consequence of a judicial decision that overrode expert testimony. He killed her because the word of one judge, applying one statutory provision, was allowed to override the collective professional judgment of psychiatrists who had studied him specifically and directly. Think about Aracy Ferreo, 16 years old, a teenager who went to a bar with her friend on an August night in 1922, in the city of Montenegro, and encountered a man who had perhaps recently left the circus. A man who could perform ease and friendliness, who could sit across from a young girl and make her feel comfortable enough that she would agree to walk with him. She fought him. In the darkness of that forest near the railroad station, she dug her nails into him and fought with everything her young body could manage. And it was not enough. Her scratches became evidence. Her resistance became proof. And she became the first entry in a criminal record that would span 3 decades. Think about Rosalina Augusta Santana, 50 years old, in 1939, an old acquaintance of Pedro's who agreed to accompany him to a vacant lot and then said no to what he wanted. She scratched him too. She fought. Her fingernails left skin beneath them that investigators would later collect and use to build a case. She was overpowered, strangled, and violated on a vacant lot in Partinan. Her refusal cost her everything. Think about Universina Alves Maria de Almeida, 43 years old, selling combs and small objects for a living, out drinking on Easter Sunday, a woman who had lived a hard life and survived it, until the night she didn't. A woman who said no in the privacy of a house on a residential street in Porto Alegre and ended up naked at the bottom of a well, discovered by a child. 3 women, 3 refusals, 3 deaths. And between the first death and the last, a gap of 30 years filled with partial imprisonments and community service assignments and parole hearings and judicial decisions and psychiatric reports. A churning institutional apparatus that touched this man repeatedly, assessed him correctly at least once, and still found a way to put him back in the world. The photographs found in Pedro's house deserve a moment of additional attention, because they speak to something important about the nature of his crimes. They were not, in themselves, evidence of murder. They were evidence of appetite, the documented visual record of the fixations he had built his inner life around. They showed that what happened in that forest in 1922, on that vacant lot in 1939, in that house in 1952, was not an explosion of impulse unconnected to everything else about him. It was the full and inevitable expression of who he had always been. The photographs were the collection of a man who had spent decades organizing his desires into a private world that he returned to again and again, that shaped how he saw women, what he expected of them, and what he was capable of doing when they declined to cooperate. The clown identity is worth returning to one more time, because it has the power to mislead if not properly understood. It is tempting to treat it as symbolic. The painted face, the hidden darkness, the laugh masking the predator. And while that symbolism is not inaccurate, it should not be allowed to become a distraction. Pedro Costa de Oliveira was not monstrous because he had once been a clown. He was monstrous because of what he was beneath whatever occupation he held. The circus gave him a nickname. It did not create the sadism. It did not install the necrophilia. It did not build the rage that killed 3 women. Those were already present, waiting, long before the grease paint was first applied. What the circus gave him was practice. Practice at performance. Practice at presenting a face to the world that the world would accept and even enjoy, while keeping hidden what moved beneath it. And that practice capacity for disguise, that easy ability to appear ordinary, served him across 3 murders in 3 different decades, across 3 different communities, against 3 different women who did not know until it was too late what they were dealing with. His 130-year sentence remained, at the time it was imposed, one of the most extraordinary in Brazilian legal history. Whether it served any practical purpose beyond the symbolic is a fair question. He was not going to live 130 years. He was not going to outlive his sentence by any measure. What it served was more like a declaration, a legal articulation of the truth that had been available since at least 1946, which was that there was no appropriate sentence for Pedro Costa de Oliveira except permanent removal from the world of living women. 130 years was the law's way of saying what psychiatrists had said more directly. He must never be free again. He was not free again. He died in that penitentiary in 1967, 17 years into his 3rd and final sentence, 71 years old, one-legged, wasted to nothing. The body that had strangled 3 women finally surrendered to the disease that prison life and age had delivered to it. There was no ceremony recorded for his passing, no account of mourners, no documentation of grief. There is something appropriate in the flatness of his ending. 3 women died terrified, in the grip of hands that showed them no mercy. They had families, histories, futures that were taken from them. Eracy Ferreiro never reached 17. Rosalina Santana died on a vacant lot refusing to be diminished. Universina Alves Maria de Almeida went into a well on Easter Sunday and was found by a child. Their endings were violent and intimate and robbed of all dignity. His ending was slow, anonymous, and small. The system that had failed those women at least had the sense, after 1952, not to fail them a 4th time. It held him, kept him, and it let him rot on the terms that the law permitted, which was all that remained to be done. But all that remained to be done is not the same as justice. Not complete justice. Not the kind of justice that gives Eracy Ferreiro back her 16-year-old life. Not the kind that returns Rosalina Santana to whatever plans she had for the day after the one she was killed. Not the kind that tells Universina Alves Maria de Almeida that the system knew what Pedro Costa de Oliveira was and chose to release him anyway, and that her death was the direct, traceable result of that choice. That kind of justice does not exist in the world this story describes. What exists is a record. A documented chain of events that stretches from a bar in Montenegro in August of 1922 to a penitentiary in Porto Alegre in 1967, with 3 dead women and 130 years of sentencing in between. What exists is the psychiatric report from 1946 that said, in language too clear to misread, that this man would kill again if released. What exists is the judicial order from 1950 that released him anyway. What exists is the body in the well, found by a child, on an Easter morning in 1952. The case of Pedro Costa de Oliveira, Pedro Palhaco, the strangling clown of Rio Grande do Sul, does not offer comfort. It does not end with a satisfying click of punishment precisely matching crime. What it offers is a warning embedded in history, that the danger of a person like this does not diminish with age, does not dissolve behind prison walls, does not become safe simply because time has passed or because a legal provision technically permits release. The psychiatrists knew. They said so. And the price of not listening was paid by 3 women who had done nothing except refuse a man who had decided their refusal was unacceptable. This is what the record shows. This is what the clown left behind. Not laughter, not performance, not the warm memory of a crowd delighted by a painted face beneath a circus tent. He left behind 3 graves. He left behind a psychiatric report that reads like a prophecy. He left behind a legal file so thick with accumulated violence that the final sentence required 3 separate murder convictions to reach its staggering total. And he left behind a question that does not go away, that this case forces us to sit with even now. When the experts say do not let him out, when the evidence says do not let him out, when the history says do not let him out, what does it take for the people with the power to sign the papers to simply listen? For Aracy Ferreo, for Rosalina Augusta Santana, for Universina Alves Maria de Almeida, it was already too late to ask. Rest now. Rest finally. In the quiet that was denied to you in the moments that mattered most. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our 3rd story. Story 3. The Doctor of Darkness. The Butcher of Altamira. The case of Inigio Ferreira de Souza, a.k.a. the healer who harvested innocence. Somewhere in the suffocating heat of the Amazon jungle, a man who had sworn an oath to preserve life was quietly, methodically, and devotedly ending it, and the town that trusted him never suspected a thing. Picture this. A doctor arrives in your struggling riverside town. He charges almost nothing for his services. He hands out food. He builds houses for the poor. He smiles at your children by name. The community exhales. Finally, someone who cares. Finally, someone who chose them. But what if that arrival was not charity? What if it was hunting? What if every act of generosity was a calculated net, cast wide and deep, designed to make your children comfortable enough to follow a stranger into the dark? What if the man with the stethoscope was not counting heartbeats to save them, but counting down? In the remote Amazon town of Altamira, Brazil, boys between the ages of 8 and 14 began vanishing like smoke between 1989 and 1993. When their small bodies surfaced, those that did, what the authorities found carved into their flesh was so savage, so deliberately precise, that seasoned investigators turned away from the scene. And at the center of it all, draped in the quiet respectability of a medical degree and the mystical authority of a spiritual leader, stood one man, Dr. Inigio Ferreira de Souza. This is not a ghost story. This is not fiction. Every name, every wound, every tear shed in this story belongs to a real child in a real town that was robbed of its most irreplaceable treasure. Stay with me, because what happened in Altamira is one of the most disturbing, most layered, and most haunting true crime cases ever to emerge from the heart of South America, and it deserves to be told in full. To understand what Altamira lost, you must first understand what Altamira was. Tucked deep inside the state of Para in northern Brazil, Altamira sits along the banks of the Xingu River, where the Trans-Amazonian Highway cuts a long, lonely scar through dense jungle canopy. In the late 1980s, it was a town still finding its footing. Part frontier outpost, part developing municipality, entirely dependent on the labor of working-class families who built their lives from soil, sweat, and river water. It was the kind of place where children played barefoot in red dust, where mothers knew their neighbors by first name, and where the community trusted one another because that trust was the only currency most of them had. The boys of Altamira roamed freely the way boys do in places that feel safe. They swam in the river. They climbed mango trees. They kicked footballs between narrow streets. They took odd jobs, shining shoes, running errands, helping at market stalls. Because poverty demanded that even the youngest pair of hands contribute something. These were not neglected children. They were loved. They were known. They were simply unprotected against a kind of evil that had never before announced itself in a place like this. The first signs were easy to dismiss. A boy missing here. A child last seen with a stranger there. In towns where poverty is chronic and families are large and stretched thin, a disappearance could have explanations. Perhaps the child had traveled to a relative's home. Perhaps he had followed an opportunity elsewhere. Perhaps he had simply wandered and would return. Authorities, underfunded and overwhelmed, initially treated each case in isolation. They did not yet have the language for what was beginning, because nothing like it had ever happened in Altamira before. But the jungle kept returning children in ways no parent could survive seeing. The first confirmed victim to rivet public attention was young Ailton Fonseca, just 10 years old. On the 5th of May, 1991, his family filed a missing persons report. 46 agonizing days passed before his remains were located. What should have been a moment of devastating but necessary closure became something worse. His body was transported to the morgue in Belém, the state capital, and then, with a cruelty that defied bureaucratic explanation, it disappeared before a proper forensic examination could be completed. A dead child, vanished twice, once from life, once from evidence. The message that sent, intentional or not, was that someone did not want the truth examined too closely. What investigators had managed to observe before the body went missing was disturbing enough. The injuries were not the result of an accident. They were not the result of a random attack by someone in a blind frenzy. There was a clinical quality to the wounds, a deliberateness, a precision that belonged not to a panicking predator but to someone comfortable with anatomy, familiar with the geography of the human body, and entirely untroubled by the suffering of a 10-year-old child. Then came Jerdali de Cunha, 13 years old. On the 1st of January, 1992, he was seen socializing with an unknown individual near a public area. He walked away with that person, and he was never seen alive again. When his body was recovered days later, investigators stood over the scene in the kind of silence that only particular horrors produce. Jerdali had been stripped naked. He had been castrated. His small body bore the marks of sexual violence, deep puncture wounds, and burns. Someone had taken their time. Someone had applied both physical force and deliberate, methodical injury over a sustained period. The burns alone suggested there had been an extended ordeal, that this boy had been alive and suffering for a duration that no child should ever experience. Ednaldo de Souza Teixeira was 12 years old when he was killed on the 11th of April, 1992. His body was recovered near an artesian well. The beating he had endured was catastrophic. His wounds told the story of someone who had been struck repeatedly, with force and with intent, by an attacker who was not in the grip of sudden rage but operating with cold, sustained purpose. James de Silva Pessoa was 13 and working, watching his family's cattle on the 1st of October, 1992, when he was taken. His body was found days later in a state that stopped the investigators cold. He had been castrated. He bore marks of prolonged sexual abuse and torture. His eyes had been gouged from their sockets. His hands had been severed at the wrists. Whoever had done this to a 13-year-old boy tending his family's livestock did not stop at murder. They performed a systematic destruction of that child's body with a patience and a thoroughness that communicated something beyond mere killing. There was ritual in it. There was ceremony. Clebson Ferreira Caldas, also 13, was found on the 17th of November, 1992, naked, castrated, tortured. The pattern was undeniable now. Even to investigators who had been slow to connect the dots, the signature was impossible to ignore. The same age range, the same method of approach. A stranger, a simple invitation, an ordinary errand or moment of freedom turned into an abduction. The same devastating injuries, the same catastrophic sexualized violence, the same precision. And then there was Flavio Lopes da Silva, 10 years old, who went missing on the 27th of March, 1993. When his body was recovered, investigators encountered wounds that pushed the documentation of this case into territory that even hardened professionals described with visible distress. Flavio had been tortured. His body carried human bite marks, evidence that whoever had done this had been intimately, physically present with the child during his suffering in a way that went beyond instrumental violence into something psychologically much darker. His genitals had been surgically removed, not torn, not hacked, but excised with a precision that investigators would later cite as evidence of medical training. His scrotum had been extracted in its entirety. He had suffered before he died. The jungle around his body was silent, indifferent, enormous, as it always is, but Altamira's jungle had not yet finished surrendering its secrets, because alongside the dead, there were survivors, and the survivors would eventually speak. The first recorded attack on a survivor occurred on the 2nd of August, 1989, when a boy identified only as Joseph, just 8 years old, left his home and was lured away by a man who engaged him in friendly conversation. Joseph was found hours later, injured and in a state of severe sexual trauma. He was 8. He had been enticed as easily as any child is enticed by a smiling adult, because children are built to trust, and something in their nature reaches toward offered kindness the way flowers reach toward light. That instinct, that beautiful and ordinary human instinct, had been weaponized against him. Then came Oatmeal, 10 years old, on the 16th of November, 1989. A man approached him with a mango, that simple, sweet, utterly ordinary fruit that grew everywhere in Altamira, on street corners and in yards, a symbol of abundance in a place that often lacked it. The man invited Oatmeal to come with him. The boy went, because why would he not? What possible reason could a child in Altamira have to fear a man offering him a mango? In the woods, the man pressed a cloth soaked in a powerful chemical over the boy's nose and mouth. Oatmeal lost consciousness. When he woke, he was bleeding between his legs. He had been castrated while unconscious. His organs had been surgically removed while he lay helpless in the jungle. He woke to mutilation, to an irreversible violation of his body, and he had to find his own way to help. Oatmeal survived. He would go on to endure dozens of reconstructive surgeries and years of psychological treatment. He still lives in Altamira. He is proof that some children carry wounds that no surgery and no amount of time will ever fully close. Waldeckley, 9 years old, was approached on the 23rd of July, 1990, by a stranger who asked him to help retrieve a kite caught in a tree. A kite, the most innocent of childhood objects. The man led him into the woods, chloroformed him, and performed the same procedure, a castration of devastating precision, on a 9-year-old boy who had simply wanted to help someone get a kite down from a tree. Waldeckley too survived. Waldeckley too would spend years in hospitals and therapy rooms, rebuilding a body and a mind that someone had decided were instruments of a ritual. The police were now under extraordinary pressure. Families were in open anguish. The community was fracturing under collective fear. Mothers kept their sons indoors. Children were forbidden from playing in the streets they had always owned. The town that had never before locked its doors was now a community held hostage by its own terror, flinching at every stranger's face, whispering the question no one could yet answer: who was doing this, and why? In 1990, police arrested a drifter named Rotilio de Souza who wandered the town streets. Investigators, desperate for a resolution, convinced themselves he was their man. He was held. He died in prison under circumstances that were never satisfactorily explained. And then, with grim inevitability, a new boy went missing. A new body surfaced bearing the same wounds, the same signature, the same incomprehensible precision. Rotilio de Souza had been the wrong man. Whatever had been killing Altamira's children was still out there, still moving freely through the town, still smiling at families from behind a face they had no reason to fear. The investigation reopened. Investigators began following a theory that had been circling the edges of the case since the beginning, that the wounds on these children were not merely violent. They were skilled. They required knowledge of anatomy that a drifter, an uneducated man wandering the streets, simply did not possess. They required the kind of knowledge you acquire in a medical school. And that was the thread that would eventually, terrifyingly, lead somewhere no one in Altamira wanted it to lead. Two doctors had recently relocated to the town. Their arrival in 1990 had been noted, but not yet with suspicion. They had set up practice. They were treating the local population. One of them had made himself almost indispensable to the community, offering services at affordable rates, providing free housing assistance, running charity drives, establishing himself as a pillar of the very community whose children were being destroyed. His name was Dr. Inigio Ferreira de Souza, and the investigation was about to turn its full, devastating attention toward him. Dr. Inigio Ferreira de Souza was born in Brazil in 1950. By the time he arrived in Altamira in 1990, he carried with him two identities that should have canceled each other out, but somehow, in the logic of this story, reinforced one another with horrifying effectiveness. He was a medical doctor. He had trained in the discipline of healing. Anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, surgical procedure, the intricate biological geography of the human body mapped and memorized over years of rigorous study. He understood how the body was built, how it could be repaired, and, with terrible inverse precision, exactly how it could be taken apart. He was also a spiritualist. Not in the vague, gentle way that many Brazilians incorporate spiritual practice into their lives alongside conventional faith, but in a more fervent, organized, doctrine-driven sense. He had become affiliated with a sect known as the Lineamento Universal Superior, the Superior Universal Lineage, a Brazilian occult organization founded by a woman named Valentina de Andrade. Understanding this group is essential to understanding everything that followed, because without the ideology of the sect, the crimes of Altamira become sensational but directionless. With it, they acquire a logic that is somehow more disturbing than random savagery, the logic of true believers doing terrible things in service of a conviction they had been persuaded to hold with absolute certainty. Valentina de Andrade had founded the Superior Universal Lineage in 1981. She was a charismatic, articulate woman who constructed a belief system from pieces of UFO mythology, reinterpreted Christian theology, and apocalyptic urgency. She taught that the God worshipped by conventional religion was a fiction, a fabrication, a grand deception. She claimed to receive transmissions from extraterrestrial intelligences, beings of superior cosmic awareness who had selected her as their earthly mouthpiece. She taught that Jesus was not divine in the traditional sense but was himself an alien emissary, dispatched to Earth by these advanced civilizations. But the most operationally dangerous element of her doctrine, the teaching that would ripple outward from her books and sermons into acts of unimaginable violence, concerned children, specifically, children born after 1981. De Andrade told her followers that these children were not innocent. They were not gifts from a benevolent universe. They were, in her framing, instruments of the false god, unconscious vessels of cosmic evil, born into the world to obstruct humanity's path toward genuine enlightenment and salvation. She published these convictions in a book titled, with breathtaking audacity, God, the Great Scam, in which she wrote that children were violent, unconscious tools of deception, and recommended that her followers exercise extreme caution in their proximity to children born after 1981. Let that settle for a moment. A woman who led a religious organization publicly declared in print that children were agents of evil, and her followers believed her. Some of them, it would emerge, believed her enough to act. Dr. Inigio de Souza was one of those followers. He was not the sect's leader. Valentina de Andrade occupied that position. But he was a committed member, and he possessed something the sect's ideology, twisted as it was, could use with catastrophic efficiency: the hands and knowledge of a trained surgeon. When he arrived in Altamira in 1990, he arrived with the second doctor implicated in this case, Dr. Cezio Brandao. Together they established themselves in the community. Together they presented to the townspeople of Altamira the faces of men who had come to serve. De Souza in particular cultivated his reputation with evident care and considerable strategy. He kept his prices low, sometimes treating patients for almost nothing. He organized donation drives. He made housing available to struggling families. He was visible, approachable, and apparently generous. He became, in the eyes of many in Altamira, something close to a community hero. And all the while, investigators would later allege, boys between 8 and 14 were being lured, abducted, mutilated, and in some cases murdered, by a ring of individuals whose methods bore the unmistakable fingerprint of surgical training. The investigation had first detained D'Souza and Brandao in the early days following the forensic observation that the wounds on the children required medical knowledge. Both were held briefly for questioning, then released when forensic analysis produced an unexpected complication. The manner in which the organs had been removed, the specific technique, the conditions in which the extractions had occurred, meant that the organs themselves would have been medically unusable for transplant by the time they reached any recipient. This temporarily derailed the theory that the children were being targeted for organ trafficking, which had been one of the working hypotheses investigators were pursuing. Without sufficient evidence to hold them, and without a clearer prosecutorial theory, both doctors were released. The case went cold. But cold is not the same as finished. And 1993 brought both new victims and a new investigative development that would change everything. Tito Mendez, 13, had vanished on the 20th of January, 1991, after being seen in the company of an unknown man near a stream where he had gone to swim. He was never found. A child identified only as JCB, 11 years old, disappeared on the 21st of August, 1991. His case was initially closed for lack of evidence, a bureaucratic abandonment of a missing child that speaks to the resource constraints and systemic failures of a rural investigation unit trying to manage cases that were, in both their nature and their number, completely unprecedented. Mauricio Farias de Souza, 12, went missing on the 27th of December, 1992, last seen in the company of a man on a red bicycle, returning to collect payment for work he had done. A small boy on an ordinary errand at the end of an ordinary year. Renan Santos de Souza, 9 years old, was last seen on the banks of the Chingu River in the company of two men on the 23rd of January, 1993. A boy identified as RFS, 11 years old and a shoeshiner by trade, disappeared on the 9th of July, 1993, leaving his tools behind at a supermarket, something he had never done before. Months before his own disappearance, his older brother had narrowly escaped an abduction attempt. The family had already been brushed by this darkness and still could not stop it from returning. By 1993, with the toll of missing and murdered children continuing to climb, investigators reopened the case with renewed urgency and a fundamentally altered understanding of what they were dealing with. The theory of isolated, random attacks was dead. This was organized. This was networked. This had a shape, and witnesses finally, critically, began to speak. An evangelical pastor came forward with testimony that detonated the investigation open. He claimed that in 1991, he had attended an event at Dr. Inigio de Sousa's residence. What he described was not a dinner party or a professional gathering. He described a ritual. He described prayers addressed not to any deity of the Christian tradition, but to what he called the God of Darkness. He described the atmosphere of the sex ceremonies, the language used, the reverence applied to practices that sat in direct opposition to the faith he himself held. His testimony was explosive, controversial, and, for investigators who had spent years unable to establish a motive, revelatory. A second witness named Edmilson de Silva Frazao corroborated the testimony of cult activity at de Sousa's residence. He claimed to have attended what he described as a satanic gathering there in 1991 and stated that Valentina de Andrade herself had been present, a claim de Andrade would vehemently deny. Another witness, a 74-year-old man named Agostino Jose de Costa, reported having encountered Dr. Cesio Brandao on the Trans-Amazonian Highway, that long, lonesome road that bisects the jungle, carrying a styrofoam box and what appeared to be a machete stained with blood. The investigation now had witnesses. It had a motive constructed from the sex ideology. It had two doctors whose medical training corresponded precisely to the clinical nature of the wounds on the victims. It had a community in ruins, a death toll that continued to mount, and a prosecutorial case that was built, as many such cases are, on testimony, on inference, on the weight of accumulated circumstantial evidence rather than on forensic proof that placed named individuals at specific crime scenes at specific moments. 7 people were ultimately indicted. The man who received the heaviest sentence, the man whose name would become most permanently attached to the horror of Altamira's lost children, was Dr. Inigio Ferreira de Souza. He was sentenced to 77 years in prison. 57 for the murders of 3 boys, 20 for the attempted murders of 2 survivors. His co-defendant Amelton Madeira Gomez, a former police officer whose presence in this network spoke to the institutional rot that had allowed these crimes to continue undetected and unpursued for so long, received 57 years. Dr. Cesio Brandeo received 56. Valentina de Andrade, despite being identified as the ideological architect of the belief system that allegedly motivated these crimes, was acquitted in 2003 after a legal process that generated controversy on multiple sides. And Dr. Inigio Ferreira de Souza, the doctor who had healed the poor, housed the vulnerable, and smiled at the children of Altamira while, according to the state, coordinating their systematic destruction, died in prison in the year 2000 at approximately 50 years of age, before serving even a fraction of his sentence. He took whatever he knew to the jungle floor. To fully grasp the scale of what occurred in Altamira between 1989 and 1993, you cannot look only at the individual crimes. You must look at the architecture beneath them, because this was not one man operating alone in the night. This was a network, deliberate, layered, and protected by the kind of social insulation that only respectability provides. The superior universal lineage was not a fringe group hiding in the shadows in the conventional sense. It was an organization with leadership, with published doctrine, with gatherings, with hierarchy. Valentina de Andrade was not whispering her beliefs in dark rooms. She was writing books. She was traveling. She was collecting followers across multiple Brazilian states and beyond the country's borders. Her organization had a presence in Parana, Goiás, and Espírito Santo, among other regions. It was structured enough to be investigated simultaneously in connection with another child murder case, the killing of Evandro Ramos Catano in Guaratuba, Parana in 1992, a case that bore disturbing similarities to the Altamira crimes in its ritualistic quality. Within this organization, Dr. Inigio de Souza occupied a position of both practical utility and spiritual commitment. His medical expertise made him uniquely valuable to whatever ritual purpose the sect had assigned to the bodies of young boys. The cult's published ideology, remember, had declared children born after 1981 to be enemies of cosmic order, agents of a false divinity that the sect was committed to opposing. It does not require much imagination, though it requires a stomach for darkness, to follow the ideological thread from that declaration to the commission of acts designed to physically destroy the perceived instruments of the enemy. What investigators and prosecutors constructed, piece by piece, witness by witness, was a picture of organized ritual activity in which medical men performed castrations as acts of religious significance, in which the suffering of children was framed within a doctrinal context that gave its participants permission to proceed. The cult did not produce monsters in the ordinary sense, produced believers, and believers, under the right conditions of doctrine and leadership, are capable of terrors that pure psychopathy rarely achieves. Because believers have a rationale, and a rationale shared among a group becomes a permission structure of almost limitless destructive potential. The precision of the injuries sustained by the victim speaks to this. Random violence, even sadistic random violence, produces a different kind of wound. It is frenzied where these were measured. It is inconsistent where these were methodical. The boys of Altamira were not attacked by someone who lost control. They were processed. Their bodies were operated upon by hands that knew exactly what they were doing, by a mind that had a clear objective and the training to achieve it. The removal of the organs in particular, performed on unconscious children who had been rendered helpless through the use of chemical sedation, reflects the workflow of a surgical procedure more than it reflects the improvisation of a street crime. The chemical agent used to incapacitate the boys, a substance applied by cloth to the face, producing rapid unconsciousness, was consistent across multiple survivor accounts. O'Donnell described it. Waldeckley described it. Their testimonies, independent of each other, aligned in this critical detail. Someone had access to a sedative or anesthetic powerful enough to render a child unconscious quickly and reliably. That is not a substance available at a street market. That is a medical compound requiring medical access and medical knowledge of correct dosage. There was also the matter of the lures. The method of approach used in case after case was not random. It was calibrated to the specific vulnerabilities and psychology of boys in this age range, in this community, in this economic context. A mango, a kite, a request for help, a friendly conversation at a public gathering point. These were not the approaches of someone improvising. They were the approaches of someone who understood how to make a child feel safe long enough to lead him away from the protection of witnesses. Someone who had studied the community, its rhythms, its children, its trust. The role of corrupt law enforcement in extending the window of impunity enjoyed by this ring cannot be minimized. Among those indicted alongside de Souza were military policemen, Carlos Alberto Santos Lima and Aldiner Ferreira Cardoso, accused of providing active protection to cult members. If accurate, this means that the network had embedded itself within the very institution responsible for investigating it. Officers who should have been tracking the crimes were, allegedly, providing cover for the criminals. This would explain, at least in part, why cases went cold with such regularity, why bodies disappeared from morgues, why witnesses were slow to come forward, why an investigation that should have converged on its primary suspects far sooner took years to arrive at the door of a doctor who had been living openly in the community, treating its residents, and dining on the trust of its most vulnerable families. The death of Rotilio de Souza, the drifter arrested in 1990, the wrong man convicted in the court of police desperation, adds another dimension of tragedy to this case. A man arrested without sufficient evidence, held in prison, dead under suspicious circumstances before his innocence could be established in time to save him, and the deaths continued after him, confirming that justice had not only failed the children of Altamira but had also consumed one of its own innocent victims in the frantic search for a resolution that the investigation was not yet equipped to achieve. The community of Altamira lived inside this nightmare for years without answers. And the psychological damage of that sustained uncertainty, that grinding, collective dread, is a wound that no conviction ever fully healed. Parents who had watched their boys play in the streets now watched those same streets with eyes that had lost their ease. Families who had lost children to the jungle and to the deliberate cruelty of organized evil carried griefs that were compounded by a justice system that moved slowly, that acquitted the alleged architect of the ideology, that watched the primary defendant die in prison before the full weight of his sentence had been applied. In 1993, a journalist named Edelson Martins brought the case to national and then international attention. His reporting transformed what had been a regional tragedy, mourned by Altamira's community but invisible to the wider world, into a story of global significance. Reuters published coverage. International news organizations picked up the thread. The pressure of that external attention accelerated the legal process and kept the case alive in ways that underfunded regional investigation alone could not have managed. Among the most harrowing details to emerge during the later phases of the investigation was the allegation, supported by testimony from multiple witnesses, that Dr. de Souza had deliberately structured his public persona in Altamira as operational cover. The charity work was not incidental to his presence in the town. The low-cost medical services were not merely expressions of humanitarian impulse. According to the prosecutor's case, these activities were strategic, designed to place him in close proximity to the community's most vulnerable members while maintaining a reputation so positive, so established, that no one would think to look at him twice. A man handing out donations to struggling families is not a man the police are watching. A doctor who treats the poor for almost nothing is not a man whose evening movements draw suspicion. And a spiritualist who organizes community gatherings is not a man whose private rituals attract outside scrutiny. Not until the bodies of children begin to accumulate with wounds that speak the language of a scalpel. There was also the question of what the sect believed it was achieving with these acts. The ideology of the superior universal lineage positioned the removal of male sexual organs within a framework of cosmic purification. A belief, however depraved, that what was being done served a transcendent purpose. The children, in this logic, were not being harmed. They were being corrected. They were being freed from their role as instruments of the false god. This is the particular madness of ideologically motivated violence, that it does not experience itself as evil. It experiences itself as necessary, as righteous, as serving something larger than the suffering it causes. That psychological insulation, the ability to commit atrocity while remaining convinced of one's own virtue, is what makes cult-driven violence so particularly difficult to detect, to prosecute, and to prevent. The perpetrators do not carry guilt in the way an ordinary criminal carries it. They carry conviction, and conviction does not leak the way guilt does. It does not produce the behavioral tells that alert investigators to ordinary criminal psychology. Presents instead as calm, as certainty, as the serenity of a man who believes he is right. Dr. Anigo de Souza, by all accounts, maintained that composure throughout the investigative and judicial process. He denied involvement. He presented himself as a man of medicine and of spirit, falsely accused by a community that needed a villain and a justice system that needed to close its books. He died in prison in 2000, maintaining, as far as the record reflects, that position to the end. Whether he was the precise instrument of these specific crimes, or whether the judicial process that convicted him was built on testimony and inference rather than irrefutable physical evidence, is a question that this case has never fully resolved. Another man, Francisco das Chagas Rodriguez de Brito, a serial killer arrested by Maranhão police years after the Altamira case was closed, claimed responsibility for 42 child murders, including 12 in Altamira. His confession threw the convictions of de Souza and his co-defendants into renewed uncertainty. The convicted men's legal representatives sought reinvestigation. The families of the victims, already exhausted by years of institutional failure, found themselves facing the possibility that the story they had been given was not the complete truth. What remains beyond any doubt, beyond any legal technicality, beyond any contested testimony, is what was done to the children of Altamira. What was cut from their bodies, what was burned into their skin, what was gouged from the faces of boys who had done nothing more dangerous than tend their family's cattle, or chase a kite into the trees, or accept a mango from a smiling stranger. Those facts do not waver. Those wounds existed. Those children suffered, and some of them died, and their mothers buried them, or tried to, when the bodies were not taken from them a second time. That is the ground truth of Altamira. And it is immovable. When the verdicts were delivered, Altamira did not erupt in the uncomplicated relief that justice is supposed to provide. The town was too scarred for that. Too many questions remained open. Too many children were still missing. Too many cases had been abandoned for lack of evidence, swallowed by a justice system that had not been designed to handle crimes of this magnitude in a region of this remoteness. The convictions, 77 years for Dr. Anigo de Souza, 57 for Amelton Madeira Gomez, 56 for Cezio Brandeo, represented legal conclusions. They did not represent peace. The acquittal of Valentina de Andrade in 2003 was perhaps the outcome that generated the most lasting bitterness among those who had followed the case with the belief that the sex leadership bore ultimate responsibility. She had written the book. She had constructed the ideology. Her published words had declared children to be enemies of cosmic order. Her organization had been linked not only to the Altamira crimes but to another child murder case in Parana. And she walked free, partly because the evidence directly connecting her to the physical commission of crimes in Altamira was circumstantial, partly because testimony attributed to her that seemed most damning was found, upon expert analysis, to have been misheard and misrepresented, and partly because the judicial process, with all its necessary safeguards and all its procedural vulnerabilities, could not reach across the gap between organizational leadership and physical perpetration without more than witnesses alone could provide. She had, by the time of her acquittal, reportedly left Brazil entirely. Investigators believed she had relocated to Argentina. She moved through this story like a ghost, enormously, structurally present in the ideology that shaped it, and yet never physically caught in the net of criminal accountability. For the families of the boys who died, for the parents who buried castrated, tortured children, for the mothers who held sons who woke up from unconsciousness to discover what had been taken from them. The acquittal of the woman who had told her followers that their children were evil was a wound of its own. And then there was the Francisco das Chagas Rodriguez de Brito complication. In the years following the closure of the Altamira case, police in the northeastern state of Maranhão arrested a man who would prove to be one of Brazil's most prolific serial killers, Francisco das Chagas, known in the press as the Monster of Altamira, a designation that preceded his exposure and which he would, in a devastating irony, eventually partially claim, confess to the murders of 42 children. He stated explicitly that 12 of those murders had been committed in Altamira. His confessed methods aligned with the signature that had defined the Altamira cases: the approach, the luring, the violence, the specific nature of the injuries inflicted. He did not claim ritual motivation. He did not claim a sect. He claimed personal compulsion, the dark private machinery of a predator who had operated entirely outside the framework of organized ideology. If Das Chagas was responsible for some or all of the Altamira murders, then de Souza and his co-defendants may have been convicted of crimes they did not commit, or may have committed some crimes while Das Chagas committed others in the same town during the same period, producing a confusion of evidence that resulted in the wrong men being convicted of the wrong specific offenses, even if their involvement in ritual harm of some kind was genuine. The Brazilian legal system did not revisit the convictions in a way that produced definitive new conclusions. The families of the victims, caught between multiple competing narratives of who had destroyed their children's lives, were left with a truth that was more fragmented than the justice system had led them to believe. Oatmeal, the survivor who woke up bleeding in the jungle as a 10-year-old, grew into adulthood carrying the consequences of what had been done to his body. He underwent dozens of surgeries, reconstructive procedures that attempted to restore some physical wholeness to a person from whom wholeness had been systematically extracted. He remained in Altamira with his mother. He agreed, on several occasions over the years, to speak publicly about what had happened to him. Not because it was easy, but because he understood that his testimony was one of the most powerful tools available to an investigation that had otherwise depended on the silent evidence of the dead. His willingness to speak, to be named, to describe the cloth pressed against his child's face and the awakening in a jungle with blood between his legs, is an act of courage that the framing of this case should not allow to be minimized by the scale of the legal drama around it. Waldeckley, the 9-year-old who had been tricked into the woods by a stranger with a kite, also survived his injuries and the years of surgical intervention that followed. 2 small boys, diminished by something no child should ever encounter, reconstructed themselves decade by decade, carrying into their adult bodies and minds the residue of someone else's conviction that they had deserved what was done to them. The families of the boys who did not survive. Of Ailton Fonseca, whose body disappeared from the morgue before it could be examined. Of Gerdaly da Cunha, burned and castrated and punctured in the first days of a new year. Of Ednaldo de Souza Teixeira, beaten to near oblivion beside an artesian well. Of Janes da Silva Pessoa, robbed of his eyes and his hands and his life while watching his family's cattle. Of Clebson Ferreira Caldas, found naked in the cold quiet of a November morning. Of Flavio Lopes da Silva, bitten and surgically destroyed and abandoned to the jungle. Those families never received the clean, complete account of what happened to their sons that they deserved. They received verdicts built on testimony. They received sentences served only partially. They received the news years later that another man had confessed to crimes attributed to the men in prison. They received ambiguity. They received grief without resolution. The town of Altamira continued to grow after the trials. It is today a considerably larger city than it was during those 4 years of terror. The Trans-Amazonian Highway still bisects the jungle nearby. The Xingu River still flows. Children still play in the streets, and the mangoes still grow, and the kites still fly. But the memory of what happened between 1989 and 1993 is embedded in the town's identity in a way that cannot be extracted without removing something essential from its history. The case of the Altamira child emasculations generated enduring attention in Brazil precisely because it pressed on multiple national wounds simultaneously. It exposed the vulnerability of poor children in rural communities, children whose disappearances initially failed to trigger the investigative urgency that the same disappearances in a wealthier, more visible setting would have produced. It exposed the capacity of organized religious ideology to provide moral permission structures for violence, the ability of a charismatic leader to take the ordinary protective instincts of her followers and redirect them, through doctrine and authority and group reinforcement, into something capable of sanctioning the slaughter of children. It exposed the corrosive effect of institutional corruption. The police officers who allegedly protected the ring, the bureaucratic failures that caused evidence to disappear, the procedural flaws that complicated prosecution at every stage. And it exposed, perhaps most chillingly, the mechanics of trust as a predatory tool. Dr. Inigo de Souza did not arrive in Altamira carrying a blade. He arrived carrying a medical bag and a reputation and a charity drive. He arrived as someone the community wanted and needed. He made himself indispensable before he made himself dangerous, and by the time the danger was visible, he had accumulated so many layers of social goodwill that those layers served as camouflage long after they should have been stripped away by investigation. This is the operating method not of a man acting on impulse, but of a man or a network of people who understood something fundamental about how communities function. Trust is not merely an emotional state. It is a social architecture. And like any architecture, it has vulnerabilities, can be designed around. It can be infiltrated by someone who has studied its blueprints long enough to know exactly which doors it leaves unguarded. The children of Altamira trusted because children are built to trust. Their parents trusted because the community was built on mutual reliance. The town trusted because a doctor who heals your sick mother and drives donation boxes to your neighborhood is not, in any ordinary cognitive framework, a person you examine for darkness. He is a person you thank. He is a person you welcome. He is a person whose invitation, when extended to your son, you accept without hesitation, because why would you not? That is the wound that this case leaves in the people who study it seriously. Not just the horror of what was done to specific children in a specific jungle town in a specific 4-year window, but the recognition of the mechanism. The understanding that this kind of horror does not announce itself. It builds a reputation first. It earns access. It embeds itself in the fabric of a community's gratitude before it begins to consume that community's most precious and undefended members. Dr. Inigo Ferreira de Souza died in prison in the year 2000. He was approximately 50 years old. He had been sentenced to 77 years and served less than a decade. The medical oath he had taken, primum non nocere, first do no harm, had been inverted into something its architects could never have conceived. He had used the knowledge of healing to destroy. He had used the social capital of a physician to access victims. He had used the authority of a spiritual leader to frame atrocity as purpose. Whether he was the precise hand that held the blade in every case attributed to this network, whether the courts built their case on solid ground or on the scaffolding of desperate testimony, whether Francisco das Chagas Rodriguez de Brito committed some or all of these crimes and the convicted men were the victims of a justice system that needed resolution more than it needed precision. These are questions that Brazil's legal record has not resolved with the clarity that the families of Altamira deserve. What is not a question, what was never a question from the moment the first small broken body was carried out of that jungle, is that something monstrous moved through Altamira between 1989 and 1993. Something organized. Something that wore the face of medicine and spirituality and community service. Something that looked at the most vulnerable children in a struggling riverside town and saw not human beings in need of protection, but instruments of a theology that demanded they be destroyed. The boys of Altamira deserved their mango trees and their kites and their mud and their rivers and their unremarkable, precious, irreplaceable childhoods. They deserved to grow into men. They deserve to be ordinary in all the ways that ordinary is, in truth, extraordinary. Ilton, Jerdali, Naldo, Janes, Clepson, Flavio, Tito, Mauricio, Rena, the ones whose names we know and the ones whose names were protected, and the ones whose cases were closed for lack of evidence, and the ones whose files still sit somewhere in a state archive with no resolution written beneath them. They were children. They were real. They were loved. And the town of Altamira, in its heat and its grief and its jungle quiet, has never forgotten them. Neither should we. Thank you for listening and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in.